Okay, let's move on to chapter 3 and see if that egg hatches. That was the most patient hen I'd ever seen. She'd been sitting there on the egg for 5 weeks now, and she hadn't shown any signs of giving up. I'll have to admit that I'd begun to slack off a bit on my end of the job, and I only turned the egg over 2 or 3 times a day now. In the mornings and in the evenings, and when I went to feed the chickens, or sometimes at lunchtime. I was beginning to lose interest in it. I guess it had been so long. Besides, the weather was so warm that I figured it didn't have to be turned so much. Maybe the hen didn't really need to sit on it, except nights, perhaps. But she was being so darn faithful about it that it made me feel kind of mean to think of giving the whole thing up before she did. And after all, she wasn't complaining and she put a lot more time into it than I had. Anyway, I had more time for fishing this way, so I didn't mind so much. After I'd done my chores at home and swept out the print shop and melted down the slugs, I'd usually pick up the rod and can and head for the Loon Lake. This particular morning, Joe Champion had gone down to Keyser Falls in the truck with his father for a load of lumber, and so I went down to the lake myself. We keep our rowboat in a little sandy cove near the road, and it was such a hot morning that I slipped off my pants and shirt and had a little swim before I started fishing. I was feeling pretty good when I climbed onto the boat and rowed out the cove. Some summer people had a few cottages around the lake, and some of them were out fishing. It's just a little lake, really more of a pond, I guess, but it's got some good bass in it. I anchored out near the ledge of the rocks where I would generally fish. I dug out a fat old worm and baited it up, and then made myself comfortable, kind of leaning back on the gunwale and holding the middle part of the rod with my toes. This sort of spreads the work around, and you don't get tired in any one place. First, fish bite better if you just relax and don't try to rush them too much. The sun sure was hot. I guess the fish were staying in the shade because I didn't even get a nibble. After a while, I got to thinking about that egg and how disappointed it was to do all the work and not have it hatch out. I began to feel that maybe Cynthia was right. There wasn't any point in going on and playing nursemaid to a freak egg all summer. But still, 5 weeks into so awfully long for a big egg like that. Some duck eggs take 5 weeks. That's a lot of time to put into one egg, of course. But I guess I got kind of funny feeling about it. And I just couldn't give up the idea that something really strange would come out of it if I just gave it time enough. Well, after giving it a lot of thought, I decided I'd hold on for another week. That would bring it to the end of July. If nothing happened by then, I'd be willing to give that egg up as a bad job. Just about as I decided that, I heard the clunk-clunk of oars bumping in oarlocks, so I lifted up the brim of my cap and looked out. Here was a little rowboat coming along towards me with a short, sort of round-shaped man in it. He was wearing a white shirt and a white hat, the kind that summer people wear. He stopped rowing about 50 feet off and swung his boat around so he could talk to me. "Any luck, Sonny?" he asked me. He had a round red face and his glasses were kind of on the end of his nose, which was pretty short. I said, "Nope." "I suspect it's a better day for swimming than for fishing," he said. "Yep," I said. "Do you live around here?" I nodded. So there they are, as you can see in your book. He didn't say anything for a while, so I said, up in town, just to help him out. He leaned back in his boat and rested his elbows on the gunwales. "You must know all the good fishing places then," he said. He kind of chuckled. "But I've more sense than to ask you where they are." He picked up a brown paper bag from the bottom of the boat and opened it. "I think I'll have my lunch," he said. "Did you bring anything to eat?" I shook my head. "Do you want a ham sandwich?" he said, and held one out for me to see it. "I don't eat all this stuff. I'm too fat already." I told him I had to go home to lunch anyway. "That's too bad. If you had your lunch with you, you wouldn't have to go all the way back home." "Oh, it isn't far," I said, "and besides I have to turn my egg over about this time." He was about to take a bit of his sandwich, but he stopped with it halfway to his mouth. "You have to what?" "Turn my egg over," I said. He looked at me kind of funny for a minute. "Would you mind explaining that to me?" he said. "What do you mean by turn your egg over?" Well, I guess it did sound a little queer when I stopped to think of it. I couldn't help laughing a little. "Well," I said, "you see, I've got this big egg that our hen laid back in June. It's a real whopper. That means huge. And I've been hoping that I could hatch it out. But I have to keep turning it over because it's too big for the hen to move. I used to turn it pretty often, but I'm kind of discouraged lately about it, and it only turns 3 times a day." He kept on looking at me for a while longer, and then suddenly his eyebrows went up. The wrinkles on his forehead went right under his white hat. He pointed his half-eaten sandwich. "Say," he said, "didn't I read about that egg in the paper some time ago? It was in the Washington Post, I remember, and it caught my eye because I have a collection of rare eggs myself. Your name must be Winchell. Was that it?" "Twitchell," I said. "Oh, yes, Twitchell. That was it. It comes back to me now. An 18-inch circumference and weighed almost 4 pounds. 3 1/4, I said, and only 15 inches around. Yes, very likely," he said, pushing his boat over to mine. "That's about the normal newspaper exaggeration. Now let me see what is your first name anyway?" "Nate," I said. "Good, I'm Dr. Zemer." "All right, Nate. Now, when was the egg laid? Do you remember?" "It was June 16th. I found it in the morning when I carried Ezekiel out of the cellar. We keep him down there because he's too noisy for the neighbors. He's our old rooster." "Oh," Dr. Zemer said. "I thought for a minute there that he was your grandfather. But I'm curious about this egg. What was its shape? Was it oval like an ordinary hen's egg? You know, round at one end and pointy at the other so it won't roll out of the nest?" "Not very. It was more long and thin, kind of like a sausage, but much bigger, of course." "I see," Dr. Zemer said. He picked up a sandwich wrapper and a wax paper and handed it to me. "Here, you eat this one. I can't digest my lunch properly with a hungry boy looking at me that way. Come on, take it." I didn't argue about it. I was hungry enough to eat the wax paper along with it. Dr. Zemer was chewing a mouthful of his sandwich and made his cheeks puff out each time he chewed. "And what about the shell, Nate? What was it like?" "It was kind of leathery. Not just soft-shelled the way a hen's egg is sometimes, but tough too. You can push it in a little with your finger." One of Dr. Zemer's eyebrows went up suddenly, but he didn't say anything. He just kept on chewing very slowly, as if he was working on a cud or something, and he kept looking out across the lake. He did this for the longest time, and I thought he might have forgotten what we'd been talking about. "Leathery, you say?" I nodded. "It would be impossible. Ridiculous idea. Nonsense." Still, then he turned around and spoke to me. "Look here, Nate. Would you mind taking me up to look at your egg? You see, I'm sort of a collector in a way, and I'd like to look at curious specimens." "Okay," I said. We rowed over to the shore and tied up the boats. When we got home, the family was eating, so I took Dr. Zemer out to the chicken yard. I lifted the hen off her nest, and she stood around craning her neck to see what was going on. Dr. Zemer bent over with his hands on his knees, looking hard at the egg. He felt it carefully with his finger, and then picked it up very gently, studied it all over. He rocked it back and forth. He even held it to his ear for a while. Finally, he put it back in the nest and pushed the straw up over it. Then he stood up. He didn't say anything for a while, but just stood there rubbing his chin, frowning at the egg. "It's impossible," he said. "What is?" I asked him. "Oh, yes, look here, Nate. Are you sure you can take good care of this egg for a while longer? You don't think the hen is getting restless after all this time? The 16th of June it was laid, didn't you say? Now let me see." He took his little calendar out of his pocket. "That makes 5 weeks, day before yesterday. 6 weeks on the 28th. Nate, may I speak to your father about this?" I took him in and introduced him to the family. Dr. Zemer bowed to my mother and Cynthia and shook Pop's hand. "Very pleased to meet you, Mr. Winchell," he said. "Twitchell," I reminded him. "Oh, yes, Twitchell, of course. I'm very sorry, Mr. Twitchell. Your boy has a very remarkable egg out there, and I think there's a chance that it may hatch. possibly within a week. You do, Pop said. Dr. Zima held up his hand. A chance, mind you. I don't want to raise your hopes unduly, but I think there is a chance. There isn't any danger it will be disturbed. No dogs or anything like that. It's such an unusual egg, you see. It should be a pity to have something happen to it. It's been there for more a month and nothing's bothered it so far. Yes, so far. But we want to make sure that nothing would bother it after it hatches. You see, it might turn out to be, well, of an unusual appearance, you know. I see, Pop said. He gave Dr. Zima a kind of funny look. We might put some extra wire around the nest. That would make it safe. Good, good. And one more thing. Would you please call me if it hatches? I'm staying with the McPhersons down at the lake. Just call me as soon as it hatches, no matter what time of day. Glad to, Dr. Zimmer. But have you any idea what it may turn out to be? It might turn out to be almost anything. I'd hardly dare guess. I wouldn't want to even suggest what I think it is. You'd think I was crazy. But I must go along and let you finish your lunch. I'll be waiting to hear from you. Goodbye. We all stood at the door and watched him going down to the road. When we were all sitting at the table again, Pop looked across at me and said, "What do you suppose he meant by an unusual appearance?" "Search me," I said. Okay, chapter 4. Let's see if it hatches. See you next time.